Welcome to Mr. Sleep Story, where stories come alive to guide you into peaceful sleep. Tonight, we journey into the mystical worlds existing in our collection of enchanting tales, where mystery, adventure, and wonder weave together under the glow of the moon. Close your eyes, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of my voice carry you to faraway lands. Today, story begins in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Tonight, we journey into the mystical world of 1001 Nights, a timeless collection of enchanting tales where mystery, adventure, and wonder weave together under the glow of the moon. The story of King Shahryar and his brother. It is related, but Allah alone is all-knowing, that there once lived in the farthest reaches of the lands 2 kings who were brothers. The elder, King Shahryar, ruled over a vast empire, while the younger, King Shah Zaman, governed the neighboring kingdom. One day, King Shahryar felt a longing to see his brother, whom he had not visited in years. He sent his trusted vizier to invite King Shah Zaman to his court. Overjoyed, Shah Zaman prepared for the journey. However, before departing, he returned to his palace unannounced to bid farewell to his wife. To his horror, he found her in the arms of another man. Devastated, Shah Zaman struck them down in a fit of rage and abandoned the palace. When Shah Zaman arrived at his brother's kingdom, his sorrow was evident. King Shahryar welcomed him with great hospitality, but the younger king remained distraught. Shahryar, noticing his brother's melancholy, inquired about its cause. At first, Shah Zaman kept silent, but eventually confessed his heartbreak. One day, as Shah Zaman gazed from his chamber, he witnessed a shocking sight in Shahryar's garden. The queen and her maids consorting with strangers. Realizing that even Shahryar was not spared betrayal, Shah Zaman's grief lightened, and he shared what he had seen with his brother. Enraged, Shahryar devised a plan. He executed the queen and her companions, vowing never to trust women again. He then embarked on a tyrannical practice. Each day, he would marry a new bride and execute her the following morning to avoid betrayal. This cruel cycle continued until Shahrazad, the daughter of the royal vizier, offered to marry the king. Despite her father's pleas, she insisted, saying, "Perhaps I can end this bloodshed and save the women of our land." On their wedding night, Shahrazad began to tell the king a tale, but as dawn approached, she stopped at a suspenseful moment. Captivated, the king spared her life to hear the rest of the story the next evening. Thus began the legendary 1001 Nights, with Shahrazad weaving tale after tale to delay her fate, and, in doing so, soften the king's heart. Shahrazad, before going to the king, had devised a clever plan. She spoke to her younger sister, Dunyazad, and said, "When I am with the king, I will summon you to my chamber before dawn. Ask me to tell a story, and I will begin one that will capture his attention. If Allah wills, this will be our salvation." That night, Shahrazad was taken to the king's chambers. As expected, King Shahryar prepared for her fate the following morning. But before dawn broke, Shahrazad wept and said, "O king, I have one last request. May I bid farewell to my beloved sister and share one final tale before I die?" The king, intrigued by her courage and beauty, agreed. Dunyazad was brought in, and she said, "Sister, if you are not too weary, please tell us one of your delightful stories to pass this last hour." With the king's permission, Shahrazad began. Once upon a time, there was a wealthy merchant who traveled far and wide, conducting his trade. One day, as he journeyed through a desert, he sat beneath a tree to rest and eat. He took out some dates, ate them, and threw the pits on the ground. Suddenly, a mighty genie appeared before him, wielding a gleaming sword. "Prepare to die," roared the genie. Terrified, the merchant asked, "What have I done to deserve this fate?" The genie replied, "You have killed my son. When you threw the date pits, one of them struck my boy and ended his life. Now I must take yours in return." The merchant pleaded for mercy, explaining that his act was unintentional. But the genie was unmoved and raised his sword to strike. The merchant begged, "Grant me a final wish. Allow me to return home to settle my affairs, bid farewell to my family, and pay my debts. I promise to return here in 1 year's time to accept my fate." The genie considered and agreed, binding the merchant by a solemn oath. The merchant returned home, put his affairs in order, and spent a sorrowful year with his family. When the year ended, he bid them farewell and set out to meet the genie, resigned to his fate. As he waited under the same tree, 3 old men approached, each accompanied by a strange creature. They asked why he was there, and the merchant told his story. The first old man said, "Let us come with you to see this genie. Perhaps we can help." When the genie appeared, the first old man said, "O mighty genie, I will tell you a story so marvelous that if you find it more wondrous than the crime of this merchant, will you spare his life?" The genie agreed, and the first old man began his tale. As Shahrazad concluded this portion of the story, dawn broke. She stopped speaking and said, "The rest of the tale will have to wait until tomorrow night." King Shahryar, eager to hear the conclusion, spared her life for 1 more day. The next day, her story continued with the first old man's tale. "Know, O mighty genie, that this gazelle you see with me is no ordinary animal but my wife. Many years ago, she was a beautiful and cunning woman, skilled in magic but lacking in virtue. We lived together peacefully for many years, though we remained childless. Desiring an heir, I took a concubine, and she bore me a son who became the light of my life. My wife, consumed by jealousy, turned her dark powers against us. One day, when I was away on business, she transformed my son into a calf and the concubine into a cow. Upon my return, she presented the animals to me and said they were a gift. I, suspecting nothing, accepted them. That year, I decided to sacrifice the cow during the feast. But when I tried to slaughter her, she wept so bitterly that I couldn't bring myself to do it. I ordered my servant to carry out the task, but when the cow was slaughtered, no meat was found on her bones, a sign of my wife's evil magic. Saddened, but still unaware of the truth, I turned my attention to the calf. The animal ran to me, licking my hands and feet as though begging for mercy. I was moved by its behavior and decided to spare its life. Instead, I gave it to a herdsman to raise. Months later, the herdsman came to me and said, "My lord, the calf you gave me behaves most strangely. It refuses to eat or drink when I am away, but grows lively and joyful when I am near. I suspect something unusual about this animal." Intrigued, I took the calf to a skilled sorceress for examination. She chanted a spell, and before my eyes, the calf transformed into my son. I wept with joy and gratitude, but my happiness was short-lived as I realized the extent of my wife's treachery. The sorceress, moved by my story, promised to help further. She cast a spell to turn my wicked wife into this gazelle you see before you. Since then, I have traveled with her as a reminder of her punishment and a warning to others of the consequences of envy and malice. When the first old man finished his tale, the genie said, "Your story is indeed marvelous. I shall grant the merchant a third of his life." The second old man stepped forward and said, "O genie, I too have a tale more wondrous than the last. If you will listen, I will tell it to you." The genie agreed, and the second old man began his tale. The second old man began his tale. "O mighty genie, this dog you see with me is not an ordinary animal, but my own brother. He has been enchanted as punishment for his wickedness, and this is how it came to pass. We were 3 brothers, born to a wealthy merchant. When our father passed, he left us a considerable fortune, which we divided equally. My 2 brothers squandered their shares on foolish ventures, while I prospered through hard work and diligence. Envious of my success, they hatched a plot to destroy me. One day they came to me, feigning remorse for their past mistakes and asking for my help. Being a kind-hearted man, I gave them a large portion of my wealth, and even invited them to travel with me on a trading journey. They agreed, and we set off together. During our journey, we came across a distant land where I saw a beautiful woman who captured my heart. I married her, and we continued our travels. My brothers, however, grew envious once more, and their jealousy turned to treachery. While we were at sea, they threw me overboard, hoping to steal my wealth and claim my wife as their own. But by the grace of Allah, I was not destined to perish. I was saved by a magical being who carried me to safety on a distant shore. There, I discovered that my wife was no ordinary woman, but a powerful sorceress. She had sensed my brother's evil intent and rescued me with her magic. Enraged by their treachery, she transformed my brothers into dogs and warned me to stay away from them forever. For 10 years, they have wandered the land in this form, seeking my forgiveness. Eventually, I took pity on them and asked my wife to reverse the spell. She agreed, but only if they truly repented for their deeds. One brother showed sincere remorse and was restored to human form, but this one, he gestured to the dog, remains under the enchantment, for his heart is still filled with malice. And so, O genie, this is the story of how my brother came to be as you see him today." When the second old man finished his tale, the genie said, "Your story is indeed marvelous. I shall grant the merchant a further third of his life." Then the third old man stepped forward and said, "O genie, I too have a tale even more wondrous than the first 2. If you will listen, I will tell it to you." The genie agreed, and the third old man began his tale. The third old man began his tale. "O mighty genie, this mule you see with me is my wife. She was transformed into this creature because of her betrayal, and here is the story. I was a merchant who spent my days traveling far and wide, conducting trade. During one of my journeys, I entrusted my wife with the care of our home and wealth. For many years, I believed her to be a loyal and virtuous woman, but I was gravely mistaken. Unbeknownst to me, she had taken a lover during my absences. When I returned from one of my travels, I learned of her deceit from a servant who could no longer bear to watch her wickedness. Devastated, I confronted her, but she denied everything and accused the servant of lying. That same evening, I caught her and her lover in the act, overcome with rage, I attempted to punish her, but she was no ordinary woman. She was skilled in magic. Before I could act, she cast a spell upon me, transforming me into a monstrous beast. For many months, I roamed the wilderness, unable to speak or defend myself. Finally, I encountered a shepherd who took pity on me and brought me to a wise and powerful sorceress. The sorceress saw through my enchantment and cast a counterspell, restoring me to my human form. She then gave me a choice: punish my wife or forgive her. I chose to confront my wife one last time. When I returned home, she was enraged to see me alive and attempted to cast another spell. But the sorceress had anticipated this and protected me. My wife's spell backfired, transforming her into this mule you see before you. The sorceress advised me to keep her in this form as a reminder of her treachery. Since that day, I have traveled with her as my companion, and she has repented every step of the way. The old man concluded his tale and said, "And now, O genie, you have heard my story. Is it not more marvelous than the others?" The genie, amazed by the third tale, said, "Indeed, your story is extraordinary. I shall grant the merchant the final third of his life and spare him entirely. You have all earned his salvation." With that, the genie vanished, leaving the merchant and the three old men to rejoice in their good fortune. They thanked one another and went their separate ways, forever bound by the remarkable tales that had saved a life. As Shahrazad concluded this story, dawn broke once more. She fell silent and said, "If the king permits, I will tell another tale tomorrow night that is even more wondrous than this." Eager to hear more, King Shahryar spared her life for another day. That evening, when the night grew quiet and the stars lit up the sky, Shahrazad began another tale to captivate King Shahryar. The Tale of the Fisherman and the Genie. Once upon a time, there was a poor fisherman who cast his net into the sea every day, hoping to catch enough to feed his family. Though his heart was kind and his labor honest, fortune seldom favored him. One morning, after casting his net 3 times and pulling up only weeds and shells, the fisherman prayed to Allah for a blessing. On his 4th cast, the net felt unusually heavy. Excited, he hauled it to shore and found a strange brass jar, sealed with lead and stamped with the symbol of King Solomon. Curious, the fisherman thought. Surely this jar contains something of great value. He broke the seal and opened the jar, but to his horror, thick black smoke poured out and swirled into the sky. The smoke coalesced into a fearsome genie, towering above him with glowing eyes. The genie roared, "Bow before me, for I am a mighty spirit imprisoned by King Solomon. For centuries, I vowed to reward anyone who freed me from this jar. But as the years passed and no one came, my anger grew. Now I swear to kill whoever releases me." The fisherman trembled and begged for mercy. "I released you from your prison. Should you not reward me instead of punishing me?" The genie sneered. "It is too late. Prepare to die." Thinking quickly, the fisherman said, "Before I meet my end, I must ask one question. How could someone as mighty as you be trapped inside such a small jar?" The genie laughed. "Foolish mortal, do you doubt my power? Watch, and I will show you." The genie transformed back into smoke and poured himself into the jar to demonstrate. The fisherman seized his chance. He grabbed the lid and resealed the jar, trapping the genie once more. The genie screamed in fury, but the fisherman said, "You swore to kill me, though I freed you. Now you shall remain in this jar forever, and be thrown back into the sea. The genie pleaded for release, promising not to harm the fisherman. At first, the fisherman refused, but the genie eventually swore a solemn oath to reward him. Reluctantly, the fisherman unsealed the jar. True to his word, the genie spared the fisherman and led him to a lake with 4 magical fish of dazzling colors: gold, silver, blue, and red. The genie said, "Cast your net here and take these fish to the king. They will bring you great fortune." The fishermen obeyed and presented the fish to the palace. The king, enchanted by their beauty, summoned his cook to prepare them. But when the cook placed the fish on the fire, a mysterious voice called out from the pan, "Spare us. We are not meant to be eaten." The king, astonished, summoned the fisherman to explain. The fisherman recounted his encounter with the genie, and the king ordered him to guide his men to the magical lake. Upon reaching the lake, the king discovered that it was surrounded by ruins of an ancient city. Curious, he explored further and stumbled upon a magnificent palace where a mysterious prince sat on a throne, weeping. The prince explained his tragic tale. He had once ruled a prosperous kingdom, but an enchantress cursed him and his people. She transformed the citizens into the lake's colorful fish and left him alone in despair. Moved by the prince's sorrow, the king vowed to break the enchantment and restore the kingdom. With the help of his court magician, the king confronted the enchantress and defeated her, lifting the curse. The lake vanished, and the kingdom returned to its former glory. The fishermen, now honored and wealthy, lived happily ever after, while the prince regained his throne. As Shahrazad concluded the tale, dawn broke once more. She paused and said, "If the king permits, I will tell another tale tomorrow night that is even more wondrous than this." Eager for more stories, King Shahryar spared her life again. That evening, when the stars shone brightly above the palace, Shahrazad resumed her storytelling to the ever-curious King Shahryar. The Tale of the Porter and the Three Ladies of Baghdad. Once upon a time, in the city of Baghdad, there was a poor porter who earned his living carrying goods for hire. One day, as he stood in the marketplace, a beautiful, veiled woman approached him and said, "Porter, take your basket and follow me." The porter, captivated by her beauty, gladly followed. The woman stopped at a wine merchant's shop and bought a variety of fine wines, then handed them to the porter. She continued to other shops, purchasing delicious fruits, nuts, and delicacies, which she added to his basket. Finally, she bought flowers and perfume. When the porter's basket was full, she said, "Follow me to my home." The porter followed her to a grand house with a large door. She knocked, and another veiled woman, even more beautiful than the first, opened it. Together, they invited him inside. The porter was amazed by the luxurious home, filled with fine furniture and beautiful tapestries. Soon, a third woman, even more enchanting than the first two, joined them. The three women welcomed the porter and offered him wine, food, and music. They told him he could relax and enjoy himself, but on one condition. He must not ask about their lives or the secrets of their home. The porter agreed, and the festivities began. As the wine flowed and the music played, the porter's curiosity grew. Finally, emboldened by drink, he asked, "Oh, gracious ladies, forgive me, but I must ask, what is the story behind your lives and this wondrous home?" The women's faces darkened, and they warned him, do not ask questions about what does not concern you, or you will hear what you will not like." Before the porter could apologize, there was a knock at the door. One of the women opened it to reveal 3 dervishes, men dressed as wandering monks, each with a shaved head and blind in one eye. They bowed and asked for shelter for the night. The women welcomed them in with the same condition: no questions about their lives. Not long after, another knock sounded. This time, it was the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, disguised as a merchant, accompanied by his vizier and a bodyguard. They, too, sought shelter, and the women extended their hospitality. As the night continued, the guests enjoyed fine food and drink. But like the porter, their curiosity grew. Despite the women's warnings, they began to ask about the mysterious household and its secrets. The women, angered by their persistence, called for whips and prepared to punish their guests. Before they could strike, the Caliph revealed his identity and demanded an explanation. The women, now knowing their guest was the ruler of Baghdad, bowed and agreed to tell their stories. Shahrazad paused as dawn approached and said, "If the king permits, I will reveal the stories of the 3 women and the dervishes tomorrow night, for they are tales of wonder and sorrow." Eager to hear more, King Shahryar spared her life for another day. The following night she began with The Tale of the First Woman. I was born into a wealthy and noble family. My father, a prominent merchant, arranged for me to marry a man of high rank. For many years we lived happily, and I believed him to be the most loyal and loving of husbands. One day, I overheard a conversation between my husband and a stranger, and, to my horror, I discovered he was plotting to steal my fortune and abandon me. I confronted him, and instead of showing remorse, he grew enraged. He bound me in chains and sold me to a slave trader. I was taken far from my homeland, where I was purchased by a kind and generous man who freed me and gave me this house as a safe haven. Since that day, I have lived here with my sisters, away from the treachery of men." When she finished, the Caliph turned to the second woman, who began her story. The Tale of the Second Woman. I, too, was once married to a man I believed to be kind and faithful. We were deeply in love, or so I thought. One day, while traveling to visit family, we were set upon by robbers. My husband, instead of protecting me, fled and left me at their mercy. The robbers took me to their hideout, where I feared for my life. But their leader, a noble-hearted man, took pity on me and protected me. He eventually helped me escape and return home. When I arrived, I found that my husband had declared me dead and remarried. Heartbroken, I sought refuge with my sister, the first woman, and vowed never to trust men again. Her tale ended, and the Caliph turned to the third woman who had been silent until now. The Tale of the Third Woman. My story is perhaps the strangest of all. I was once married to a wealthy merchant who showered me with love and gifts. But despite his generosity, I felt he kept secrets from me. One day, I discovered a locked door in our home that I had never seen before. My curiosity overwhelmed me, and when my husband was away, I found the key and opened the door. To my shock, inside was a magical garden filled with golden trees, singing birds, and a fountain that sparkled like diamonds. As I stepped into the garden, a powerful enchantment took hold of me, and I was unable to leave. My husband returned, furious that I had discovered his secret. He cursed me and left me there to wander the garden for years. Eventually, a kind sorcerer broke the enchantment and set me free. I returned to my sisters, and we decided to live together in this house, bound by our shared sorrows. When the women finished their tales, the three dervishes stepped forward to share their own stories. The tale of the first dervish. I was once a prince, the heir to a great kingdom. But my happiness was short-lived, as my uncle betrayed my father and usurped the throne. I fled for my life, disguising myself as a dervish to avoid detection. During my travels, I came upon a strange cave where I found an enchanted chest. Inside was a woman who claimed to be cursed by a genie. She begged me to help her, but before I could act, the genie returned and, in his rage, struck me blind in one eye. Since that day, I have wandered the world as you see me now, seeking a way to restore my sight and reclaim my kingdom. The caliph and his companions were amazed by the tales and promised to hear the stories of the other two dervishes the following night. At this point, Shahrazad paused, for dawn had broken. She said, "If the king permits, I will continue the tales of the dervishes tomorrow night, for they hold even more wonders." Eager to hear more, King Shahryar spared her life for another day. The Tale of the Second Dervish. The second dervish began his tale. I, too, was once a prince, destined to inherit a mighty kingdom. My life was full of luxury and promise, but fate had other plans. One day, my father received news of a powerful neighboring king who sought an alliance through marriage. The king offered his daughter's hand to me, and my father agreed. With great ceremony, I traveled to the neighboring land to meet my bride. She was as beautiful as the moon, and I fell deeply in love with her. However, on the night of our wedding, disaster struck. As we celebrated, an enormous winged creature, a mighty roc, descended from the skies, snatched my bride, and carried her away. I was devastated and vowed to rescue her, no matter the cost. I set out on a perilous journey, facing storms, wild beasts, and endless deserts. After many months, I reached a distant island where I found the roc perched on a high cliff. Below it was a cavern, and inside the cavern, I found my bride. She told me she had been enchanted by a sorcerer who controlled the roc. With her guidance, I confronted the sorcerer and struck him down. But as I freed her, the enchantment he had cast took hold of me, and I was blinded in one eye. Grateful for her rescue, my bride returned to her father's kingdom, but I could not remain there. Ashamed of my condition, I left my homeland and have wandered ever since as a dervish, seeking solace for my loss. The dervish finished his tale, and the caliph turned to the third dervish, who began his story. The Tale of the Third Dervish. I, too, was born to royalty. My father was a great king who ruled over a prosperous land. From a young age, I was trained in the arts of war and governance, destined to inherit the throne. But, as fate would have it, my life took a tragic turn. One day, while hunting in the forest, I encountered a mysterious woman of extraordinary beauty. She claimed to be a princess who had been cursed by an evil magician. Enchanted by her tale, I vowed to help her and took her back to my palace. For a time, all seemed well. She became my companion, and I began to fall in love with her. But one night, I awoke to find her standing over me, holding a dagger. "Why would you betray me?" I cried. She laughed and revealed her true nature. She was no princess, but a sorceress sent by my enemies to destroy me. With a wave of her hand, she cast a spell that left me blind in one eye and banished me from my kingdom. I wandered aimlessly until I joined the Brotherhood of Dervishes, where I found solace among others who had suffered great misfortune. Together, we have roamed the world, seeking redemption and purpose. When the third dervish finished his tale, the Caliph was deeply moved. He turned to the three sisters and asked why they had warned their guests not to ask questions. The eldest sister replied, "We imposed this condition because our lives are full of sorrow, and revisiting these tales brings us great pain. But now that our secrets are revealed, we hope for peace and understanding." The Caliph, impressed by their honesty and resilience, decreed that they should be rewarded. He invited them to his palace, where they were given wealth and protection. The dervishes, too, were offered positions in the royal court. As for the porter, he returned to his humble life, grateful for the adventure he had been part of. As dawn approached, Shahrazad paused and said, "If the king permits, I will tell another tale tomorrow night that is even more wondrous and captivating." Eager to hear more, King Shahryar spared her life once again. As the next night fell, King Shahryar eagerly awaited Shahrazad's storytelling. With her calm, soothing voice, she began. The Tale of the Ensorcelled Prince. Once upon a time, there was a great king who had a son of remarkable beauty and wisdom. This prince was loved by his people and admired by all who met him. One day, the prince married a woman of extraordinary beauty and charm. He loved her deeply and trusted her with his whole heart. For several years, they lived in happiness and harmony. But unbeknownst to the prince, his wife was harboring a dark secret. She had fallen in love with a slave, and the two would meet in secret whenever the prince was away. One day, the prince discovered their betrayal. Heartbroken and enraged, he confronted his wife. Instead of showing remorse, she turned to black magic. She cast a powerful spell on the prince, transforming the lower half of his body into stone, leaving him half man and half statue. Unable to move or walk, the prince was left helpless in his own palace. The treacherous wife then took control of the kingdom, ruling it with cruelty and deceit. The prince's misery grew each day until a kind sorcerer visited the palace. The sorcerer, seeing the prince's plight, vowed to help. He told the prince, "To break this curse, I will need to confront your wife and undo her magic. But it will require great courage and patience from you." The sorcerer disguised himself as a wandering dervish and approached the queen. Using his wisdom and cunning, he tricked her into revealing the secrets of her spell. Once he learned how to reverse the enchantment, he cast a powerful counterspell. The queen was defeated and her magic unraveled. The prince was restored to his full form, and his kingdom was freed from her tyranny. Grateful for his freedom, the prince rewarded the sorcerer and vowed to rule with justice and compassion, never allowing such betrayal to take hold again. As Shahrazad paused, dawn broke, and she said, "If the king permits, I will tell another tale tomorrow night, even more wondrous than this." King Shahryar, mesmerized by her storytelling, spared her life for another day. As the following night fell, Shahrazad once again began her tale. The stars glittered in the night sky, and King Shahryar sat eagerly to listen. She said, The Tale of the Three Apples. In the ancient city of Baghdad, during the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, there lived a poor fisherman. One day, after casting his net repeatedly without success, he pulled in a heavy, locked chest. Excited by his find, he brought it to the palace and presented it to the Caliph, hoping for a reward. The Caliph ordered the chest to be opened, and inside they found a woman's body cut into pieces. Horrified, the Caliph summoned his vizier, Jafar, and said, "You must find the murderer within 3 days, or you will be executed in their place." Jafar, though loyal and wise, was overcome with fear. He had no idea how to solve the mystery. For 3 days, he searched fruitlessly. When the deadline arrived, he prepared for his execution. As he stood before the Caliph, ready to accept his fate, a man rushed into the palace shouting, "I am the murderer. Spare Jafar and punish me instead." The Caliph demanded an explanation. The man said, "This woman was my wife. I loved her dearly, but one day she fell ill. To lift her spirits, I bought her 3 apples from a merchant, for which I paid a great sum. When I returned home, I found her recovering and gave her the apples. However, some days later, I saw a slave holding one of the apples. He claimed my wife had given it to him. Enraged by her betrayal, I confronted her, and she denied any wrongdoing. But in my fury, I did not listen and killed her. I now regret my actions deeply." As the man wept, a young boy approached the Caliph and said, "O mighty Caliph, do not punish my father, for he is innocent." Startled, the Caliph asked the boy to explain. The boy said, "I took one of the apples from my mother without her knowledge. While playing in the street, I showed it to a slave, who then snatched it from me and claimed my mother had given it to him. It was my foolishness that caused this tragedy." The Caliph, realizing the truth, spared the man and punished the slave instead. He then pardoned Jafar and commended him for his service. Shahrazad paused as dawn approached. She said, "If the king permits, I will tell another tale tomorrow night that will surpass even this one in wonder." King Shahryar, entranced, spared her life once more. As the next night descended, Shahrazad began her tale once more, her voice soothing and entrancing. The Tale of Nur al-Din and Shams al-Din. In a distant city there lived 2 brothers, Nur al-Din and Shams al-Din, both sons of a noble and wealthy vizier. Before his death, their father divided his fortune equally between them and made them promise to care for each other. For many years they lived harmoniously. However, one day they quarreled over their future. Shams al-Din, the elder brother, argued that they should arrange marriages for their children once they were born, ensuring that the family's wealth and honor remained intact. Nur al-Din disagreed, claiming such plans were foolish since neither had yet married or had children. Their argument escalated, and Shams al-Din grew angry. He insulted Nur al-Din, belittling him in front of their servants. Feeling humiliated, Nur al-Din left the city, vowing never to return. He traveled for many days and eventually reached a distant land. There, he befriended a kind merchant who helped him establish a new life. Soon, Nur al-Din married a beautiful and virtuous woman, and they had a son whom they named Badr al-Din. Years passed, and Nur al-Din's fortunes grew. Meanwhile, back in his homeland, Shams al-Din had also married and fathered a daughter named Sit al-Husn, famed for her unparalleled beauty. True to his word, Shams al-Din planned to arrange a marriage for his daughter, but he still held resentment toward his brother. The fate of Badr al-Din. When Badr al-Din came of age, tragedy struck. Nur al-Din passed away. Left to fend for himself, Badr al-Din set out on a journey to find his uncle, Shams al-Din, unaware of the bitterness that still lingered. As fate would have it, Badr al-Din arrived in his uncle's city on the night of Sitt al-Husayn's wedding. However, the groom, chosen by Shams al-Din, fled the city out of fear, leaving the bride without a husband. The Caliph, upon hearing of this misfortune, decreed that Sitt al-Husayn must be married that very night. Desperate, Shams al-Din searched for a replacement groom. By chance, he encountered Badr al-Din, who bore a striking resemblance to his late brother. Without knowing Badr al-Din's identity, Shams al-Din brought him to the palace and arranged for him to marry Sitt al-Husayn. After the wedding, a strange series of events occurred. A mischievous genie, intrigued by the couple's fate, cast a spell that transported Badr al-Din far away, leaving Sitt al-Husayn alone. For many years, Badr al-Din wandered, unaware that he had a wife or that his uncle was the one who had arranged the marriage. Meanwhile, Sitt al-Husayn gave birth to a son, who grew up without knowing his father. Eventually, fate brought Badr al-Din back to his homeland, where he encountered his son by chance. The resemblance between them was undeniable, and through a series of revelations, the truth of his identity was uncovered. Shams al-Din, realizing the cruelty of his past actions, reconciled with his nephew and welcomed him back into the family. Badr al-Din and Sitt al-Husayn were reunited, and they lived happily ever after, their love and family bonds stronger than ever. As dawn approached, Shahrazad fell silent and said, "If the king permits, I will tell another tale tomorrow night, one filled with even greater wonders." King Shahryar, captivated, spared her life for yet another day. And so, the tales of 1001 Nights fade into the quiet of the night, leaving behind whispers of adventure and wonder. I hope this story has brought you closer to a peaceful and restful sleep. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime stories to soothe your soul. Your support helps keep these magical tales alive. Sweet dreams, and until next time, may your dreams be bright and your heart be light. Good night. Marley was dead, to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change, for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind! I don't mean to say that I know, of my own knowledge, what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined, myself, to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat, emphatically, that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night, in an easterly wind, upon his own ramparts, than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot. Say, St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. But he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices, like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by, and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting-house was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, But the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I am sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said, "Bah!" again, and followed it up with, "Humbug." "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be," returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer. A time for balancing your books and having every item in 'em through a round dozen of months presented dead against you." "If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding, and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should." "Uncle!" pleaded the nephew. "Nephew," returned the uncle sternly, "keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it," repeated Scrooge's nephew, "but you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone, then," said Scrooge. "Much good may it do you. Much good it has ever done you." "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of, in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression, and said that he would see him in that extremity first. "But why?" cried Scrooge's nephew. "Why?" "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if that were the only one thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry, with all my heart, to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party. But I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge, "and a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago, this very night. We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner," said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head, and handed the credentials back. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "And the union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are." "Still," returned the gentleman, "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, then," said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid, from what you said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I'm very glad to hear it." "Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude," returned the gentleman. "A few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink, and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "You wish to be anonymous." "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that." "But you might know it," observed the gentleman. "It's not my business," Scrooge returned. "It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen." Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself, and in a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses in carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible, and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds, with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street at the corner of the court, some laborers were repairing the gas pipes, and had lighted a great fire in a brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The water plug being left in solitude, its overflowings sullenly congealed, and turned to misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers' and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces. And at the same time, there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people, carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as their bearers passed, sprinkled his incense on their dinners from his torch. It was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly, for they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day. And so it was. God love it, so it was. The office was closed in a twinkling, and Scrooge, with his thin lips blue, went homeward to his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. Having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, in a lowering pile of building up a yard, where it had so little business to be, that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it, night and morning, during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, aldermen, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley, since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not in impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and, though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That, and its livid color, made it horrible. But its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so he said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above, and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below, appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs, or through a bad young Act of Parliament. But I mean to say, you might have got a hearse up that staircase, and taken it broadwise, with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easy. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual. Old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus, secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like featherbeds, Abraham's, Belshazzar's, apostles putting off to sea in butterboats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on everyone. "Humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room, and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment, and with a strange, inexplicable dread, that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound. But soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below. Then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door, and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up, as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long, and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. "No, nor did he believe it even now," said Scrooge in answer to his own thought, though he looked the phantom through and through, and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say, "to a shade," but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair. and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror. For the specter's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit, staring at those fixed, glazed eyes in silence for a moment, would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the specter's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven. "You see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. "You are not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, notwithstanding. "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug." At this the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy," he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow-men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me! And witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or, would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this, 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable. But he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly. "Old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me." "It was no doubt very dull and tedious," observed Scrooge. "Dull and tedious," echoed the ghost. "It was my business. Business. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." It held up its chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. "At this time of the rolling year," the specter said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the specter going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me," cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob. Pray. How it is that I appear before you in a shape that you can see, I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day. It was not an agreeable idea." Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. "That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer." "You were always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "Thank ye." "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits." Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering voice. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. "Couldn't I take 'em all at once, and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge. "Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us." When it had said these words, the specter took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an attitude of perfect melancholy. Its ghostly eyes were fixed upon him. As Scrooge looked, it raised a mournful cry and shook its chain with a dismal and appalling noise, and fled into the darkness, leaving Scrooge in terror. Thank you for joining us tonight on Mr. Sleep's Story. We hope this story has brought you peace, relaxation, and perhaps a bit of holiday cheer. If you enjoyed this bedtime reading, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more soothing stories to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. We'd love to hear your thoughts or suggestions for future tales in the comments below. Until next time, may your nights be restful, your dreams be sweet, and your heart be light. Sleep well, and happy holidays. Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, and the rest of these gentlemen having asked me to write down the whole particulars about Treasure Island, from the beginning to the end, keeping nothing back but the bearings of the island, and that only because there is still treasure not yet lifted, I take up my pen in the year of grace 17, and go back to the time when my father kept the Admiral Benbow Inn, and the brown old seaman with the saber-cut first took up his lodging under our roof. I remember him as if it were yesterday, as he came plodding to the inn door, his sea-chest following behind him in a hand-barrow. A tall, strong, heavy, nut-brown man, his tarry pigtail falling over the shoulders of his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred, with black, broken nails, and the savor of old ship's biscuit about him in the hot, dry wind. I remember him looking round the cove and whistling to himself as he did so, and then breaking out in that old sea song that he sang so often afterwards. 15 men on the dead man's chest. Yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. In the high, old, tottering voice that seemed to have been tuned and broken at the capstan bars. Then he rapped on the door with a bit of stick like a handspike that he carried, and when my father appeared, called roughly for a glass of rum. This, when it was brought to him, he drank slowly like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste, and still looking about him at the cliffs and up at our signboard. "This is a handy cove," says he at length, "and a pleasant, sitiated grog shop. Much company, mate?" My father told him no, very little company, the more was the pity. "Well then," said he, "this is the berth for me. Here you, matey," he cried to the man who trundled the barrow. "Bring up alongside and help up my chest. I'll stay here a bit," he continued. "I'm a plain man. Rum and bacon and eggs is what I want, and that head up therefore to watch ships off. What you mought call me? You mought call me captain. Oh, I see what you're at. There." And he threw down 3 or 4 gold pieces on the threshold. "You can tell me when I've worked through that," says he, looking as fierce as a commander. And indeed, bad as his clothes were and coarsely as he spoke, he had none of the appearance of a man who sailed before the mast, but seemed like a mate or skipper accustomed to be obeyed or to strike. The man who came with the barrow told us the mail had set him down the morning before at the Royal George, that he had inquired what inns there were along the coast, and, hearing ours well spoken of, I suppose, and described as lonely, had chosen it from the others for his place of residence. And that was all we could learn of our guest. It was not long before the stranger began to show what a rough life he had led. He would stay all day long in his room or on the cliff with a brass telescope. Seldom he would even take a turn or two along the beach, limping on his injured leg. And when he did so, he was always on the lookout for passing ships. At other times, he would sit in a corner of the parlor next to the fire, and drink rum and water very strong, and stare straight ahead of him. He seldom spoke with us, but when he did, it was always with a gruff expression. And he paid my father generously for the trouble he caused us. The only name he went by was the captain, and this he did not deny. But whether he had another name or not, we could not tell. He did not keep himself to himself entirely. He would join the few that came to the inn at night, but his sea stories, though well told, were often terrifying and gruesome. His manners and vocabulary seemed to have a strong effect on my father, who, though he had faced many a sailor, was somewhat afraid of our guest. I remember the night when he sang his sea song and thumped the table for emphasis. The other men stopped their own conversation and looked at him in alarm. And then he would demand silence, glaring from one face to another, and people found it hard to deny him. But there were moments of strange fear that clung to him. I remember, on one occasion, his pacing back and forth, muttering to himself about a one-legged man. The words, "He'll find me yet," escaped him in a tone so forlorn that even I, a boy, felt pity for him. My father, hearing this, thought it unwise to ask questions, but I could not resist. "Who is the one-legged man?" I asked. The captain turned on me sharply, his face pale and fierce. "That's none of your business, boy," he snapped, and his sudden anger frightened me so much I did not ask again. From that moment, I avoided him, and though curiosity burned in me, I was glad to stay out of his way. Despite his strange behavior, the captain paid well for his lodging, and his gold was always welcome. My father was ill during these days, and I was often left to help run the inn. But the captain's stay was far from uneventful. Though he seemed to be hiding from something, or someone, his time at the Admiral Benbow would soon bring much more excitement and danger than we could have imagined. It was one January morning, very early, a pinching, frosty morning, the cove all gray with hoar frost, the ripple lapping softly on the stones, the sun still low and only touching the hilltops and shining far to seaward. The captain had risen earlier than usual and set down the cliff with his telescope under his arm. A feat I had found he practiced daily, for, as he said, the sea keeps no regular hours. Now I was upstairs in the room where the captain slept. I had been tidying up and moving his great sea chest to sweep beneath it. It was the first time I had dared to open his belongings, though the chest was not locked, and inside I saw strange and foreign objects. A quadrant, a few curious shells, some bits of scrimshaw carved with intricate designs, and, at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of sailcloth, a packet sealed with wax. I did not dare to meddle further. A sense of dread crept into me as I replaced the chest's lid and finished my chores. That very day, something happened to confirm my growing unease about our guest. It was mid-morning when a stranger appeared at the inn. He was a pale, tallowy creature, scarred and sinister, with a voice like a thin rasp. He had but 3 fingers on his left hand and carried a stick which he thumped on the floor with a peculiar rhythm. He inquired at once for the captain, describing him in exact detail and asking if he was presently lodging with us. Before I could answer, he pulled me closer and hissed, "Tell him there's a friend looking for him." When the captain returned, the man was waiting in the shadow of the doorway. There was a moment of recognition, and then an ugly scene erupted. The captain, already pale with drink, turned as white as a sheet. He bellowed in rage, striking the man with his stick, but the man laughed cruelly, seeming to enjoy the captain's terror. "You'll be seeing more of us," the man said, "and don't think we'll forget about Flint's business, matey." With that, he left, leaving the captain shaking and muttering curses to himself. From that moment on, I knew our lives were tied to a dangerous game, and the shadow of the one-legged man loomed larger in my mind. Little did I know how deeply I'd be drawn into the dark secrets of Treasure Island. It was not long after this that there occurred the first of the mysterious events that rid us at last of the captain, though not, as you will see, of his affairs. It was a bitter, cold winter, with long, hard frosts and heavy gales, and it was plain from the first that my poor father was little likely to see the spring. He sank daily, and my mother and I had all the inn upon our hands, and were kept busy enough without paying much regard to our unpleasant guest. It was one January morning, as I was setting the breakfast table for the captain, and my mother was upstairs with my father, that the parlor door opened, and a man stepped in on whom I had never set my eyes before. He was a pale, tallowy creature, wanting 2 fingers of the left hand, and though he wore a cutlass, he did not look much like a fighter. I had always my eyes open for seafaring men, with 1 leg or 2, and I remembered this one puzzled me. He was not sailorly, and yet he had a smack of the sea about him, too. I asked him what he wanted, and he said he would take a glass of rum. When I had brought it to him, he drank slowly, like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste, and still looking about him at the cliffs and up at our signboard. "This is a handy cove," says he at length, "and a pleasant, sitiated grog shop. Much company, mate?" I answered him that we had very little company, and the more was the pity. "Well then," said he, "this is the berth for me. Here you, matey," he cried to the man who trundled the barrow. "Bring up alongside and help up my chest. I'll stay here a bit," he continued. "I'm a plain man. Rum and bacon and eggs is what I want, and that head up therefore to watch ships off. What you mought call me? You mought call me captain." He threw down 3 or 4 gold pieces on the threshold. "You can tell me when I've worked through that," says he, looking as fierce as a commander. I went at once to tell my mother about the new guest, and we were talking it over when a 3rd man joined the company. He was a seafaring man, but more plainly dressed, and he too had that suspicious, watchful look about him. When the captain came down and saw him, his face turned deadly pale. The newcomer was none other than the man who went by the name of Black Dog. Black Dog greeted the captain with a loud voice. "Ah, Bill, mate," he cried, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's been a long time since we've had a chat." The captain, whom I had never known to tremble, sat staring at Black Dog like a man who sees a ghost. Then he burst out swearing at him. Black Dog kept his temper and looked at him steadily. "Now, Bill, mate, you're in the wrong of it," said he. "We're not here to argue. I just want to have a talk, like the good old shipmates we were." The captain stood up, and with a sort of savage look, he slammed the table with his hand. "Talk, is it? That's all I'll do with you, Black Dog, and precious little of it." They sat down at the table together and began talking in low voices. I could not catch much of what was said, but now and then I heard the name Flint, and at times it seemed they were arguing fiercely. Suddenly, the captain sprang to his feet, drew his cutlass, and with a cry of rage lunged at Black Dog. Black Dog was quick and dodged the blow, springing out the door and running up the road like a deer. The captain hesitated for a moment as if he might give chase, but then he reeled, clutched at his chest, and fell to the floor. I ran to help him, but his face was ashen and he was breathing hard. "Rum!" he gasped. "Bring me rum!" I fetched it quickly, and he drank it in great gulps. His strength seemed to return a little, and he sat up against the wall. "I've been a fool," he said. "I should have known they'd find me. Now it's my old shipmates after the map. But it's not them that'll get it. It's you, boy. You keep an eye out for a one-legged man." Then he sank back, his eyes closing, and for a moment I thought he was dead. But soon he began to breathe more easily, and the color returned to his face. He was still weak, but he waved me off, muttering, "Leave me be. Leave me be." I went back to the kitchen, my mind full of what I had seen and heard. Black Dog was gone, the captain was gravely ill, and the mention of Flint's map and the one-legged man had filled me with foreboding. Little did I know how soon all these things would come crashing into my life in ways I could never have imagined. When I returned to the parlor, the captain was lying as I had left him, on his back, with his eyes open and one hand pressed to his side. "What's wrong?" I asked him. "It's my chest," he said weakly. "I'm having one of my old fits. It's the rum, you see. I was warned against it. I've lived on rum these years past, and it's been my ruin. But I'm a warning to you, boy. None of that, none of that. Now, boy, you see me. I'm pretty low and deserted by all. And, matey, you'll bring me one noggin of rum now, won't you, matey?" I told him I would fetch my mother, but he grew impatient and demanded the rum. When I refused, he flew into a rage and struggled to rise, but sank back with a groan. "They'll have the black spot on me by now," he said. "It's my old shipmates, boy. Flint's crew, dirty dogs. But if they put the black spot on me, boy, you go to the magistrates and tell them all. The name's Captain Flint. There's some money, what I've got left, and they'll give you half of it for your trouble. You've seen Black Dog, you can't mistake him. There's no good in Black Dog now, but the rest will follow, boy. You keep your weather eye open, boy." As he talked, he grew more and more agitated, and soon his words were no more than ramblings. He lay there trembling, the sweat standing on his brow, and before I could call for help, he had fallen into a kind of stupor. I left him and went to tell my mother, who was tending to my father upstairs. Before long, the captain stirred again, and his cries of "Rum!" echoed through the inn. My mother and I agreed that we could not manage the captain alone, and so I set off to fetch Dr. Livesey. Dr. Livesey came promptly, and I led him to the captain. He listened to his chest and shook his head gravely. "The man is very ill," the doctor said. "It's a pity I can't help him without cooperation. The drink has been his undoing." The captain stirred and opened his eyes. When he saw the doctor, he seemed to understand his situation. "Doctor," he said faintly, "I've run my course." "You've run it true enough," replied Dr. Livesey. "Rum is your poison, and rum has brought you here." "Give me a chance, doctor," the captain pleaded. "Help me, and I'll tell you where Flint's gold is." The doctor raised an eyebrow, but remained firm. "I can't do anything for you unless you stop drinking." The captain grumbled, but after a long moment he nodded. Dr. Livesey prepared a treatment and left instructions with me and my mother to follow closely. That evening, as the storm rattled the shutters of the inn, there came a knock at the door. My mother opened it cautiously to reveal a blind man, shabbily dressed and leaning on a stick. His face was cruel and menacing despite his sightless eyes. "Take me to the captain," he demanded in a harsh voice. My mother hesitated, but he struck out with his stick, forcing his way in. "Lead me to him, boy," he barked at me. Terrified, I obeyed and guided him to the captain's chair. The blind man seized the captain's hand and pressed something into it. "That's for you, Bill," he said. "The black spot. You've till 10 tonight." With that, he turned and hobbled out of the inn. The captain stared at the small, round object in his hand. His face went as pale as death, and he began to tremble violently. "The black spot!" he cried. "I'm a marked man, boy. They'll come for me now." I asked what it meant, but he was too far gone in his terror to answer. Instead, he clutched his chest and collapsed into his chair. Ran to fetch my mother, and together we tried to rouse the captain, but it was no use. He had fallen into some kind of fit, and no effort of ours could bring him back to his senses. After a while, his breathing grew weaker and weaker, until at last it stopped altogether. The captain was dead. My mother was resolute. "We'll have no dealings with that dreadful crew," she said. "But we'll not lose what is owed to us either. I mean to open his chest and take what he owes us for his lodging. Let's find the key." The key was not on the captain, so we turned to the sea chest. It was large and heavy, reinforced with iron bands and locked tight. My mother was determined to open it, and I had to agree with her. There might be danger in leaving it untouched, and we needed the money. We found a key tied around the captain's neck on a string. I hesitated before unlocking the chest, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and dread, but my mother urged me on. Inside the chest, we found a variety of strange items: a suit of fine clothes, somewhat stained and worn, a collection of trinkets and curiosities from foreign lands, several gold coins, and, at the very bottom, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. My mother began to count the coins, determined to take only what was owed to her. "I'll have no blood money," she said firmly. But as she counted, a faint sound reached our ears, a tapping, or perhaps the faint scrape of footsteps outside the inn. We froze. "They're coming," I whispered. "We must leave." But my mother was stubborn. "I'll not run from thieves," she said. "I'll take what we're owed and no more." The sound outside grew louder, a low murmur of voices, the clink of weapons. My mother and I looked at each other in terror. There was no time to argue. I seized the bundle from the chest, closed the lid, and urged her to flee with me. We slipped out the back door and ran down the hill toward the village. The night was dark and stormy, the wind howling in our ears. Behind us, we could hear the crashing of the inn door as the men broke in. We reached the home of Dr. Livesey and pounded on the door. He was not at home, but his servant promised to fetch him at once. We waited in fearful silence, clutching the bundle from the chest. I felt as though all the horrors of the captain's life were now descending upon us. When Dr. Livesey arrived, we explained everything: the captain's death, the black spot, and the contents of the chest. He examined the bundle and found within it a map, marked with the outline of an island and strange notations about treasure buried there. "This," he said gravely, "is the map to Captain Flint's treasure. We must act quickly. Those men won't stop until they have it." With that, we began to make plans, not realizing how dangerous and thrilling the adventure ahead of us would become. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. I hope this story brought you relaxation and a sense of wonder as you drifted off to sleep. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mr. Sleep Story for more soothing bedtime adventures. Share this with someone who could use a little peace and calm in their night. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with magic and your nights restful. Sleep well. I'll see you in the next story. Our story this evening was written by one of the greatest American writers in history, Mark Twain. We'll begin with his beloved classic, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. It's a tale full of adventure, childhood mischief, and the charm of simpler times. Together, we will explore the banks of the Mississippi River, where the sound of flowing water and the spirit of youthful curiosity set the stage for relaxation. So, get cozy, snuggle under your blanket, rest your head on your pillow, and allow your mind to wander as we step into this delightful tale. Remember, you don't need to stay awake to follow the story. Just let the words carry you away to a world of peace and serenity. Now, let's begin. Tom. No answer. Tom. No answer. What's gone with that boy, I wonder? You, Tom. No answer. The old lady pulled her spectacles down and looked over them about the room. Then she put them up and looked out under them. She seldom or never looked through them for so small a thing as a boy. They were her state pair, the pride of her heart, and were built for style, not service. She could have seen through a pair of stove lids just as well. She looked perplexed for a moment, and then said, not fiercely, but still loud enough for the furniture to hear, "Well, I lay if I get hold of you, I'll—" She did not finish, for by this time she was bending down and punching under the bed with the broom, and so she needed breath to punctuate the punches with. She resurrected nothing but the cat. I never did see the beat of that boy. She went to the open door and stood in it, and looked out among the tomato vines and Jimson weeds that constituted the garden. No Tom. So she lifted up her voice at an angle calculated for distance and shouted, "You, Tom!" There was a slight noise behind her, and she turned just in time to seize a small boy by the slack of his roundabout and arrest his flight. "There, I might have thought of that closet. What you been doing in there?" "Nothing." "Nothing? Look at your hands, and look at your mouth. What is that truck?" "I don't know, Aunt." "Well, I know. It's jam. That's what it is. 40 times I've said if you didn't let that jam alone, I'd skin you. Hand me that switch." The switch hovered in the air. The peril was desperate. "My, look behind you, Aunt." The old lady whirled around and snatched her skirts out of danger. The lad fled on the instant, scrambled up the high board fence and disappeared over it. His Aunt Polly stood surprised a moment, and then broke into a gentle laugh. "Hang the boy. Can't I never learn anything? Ain't he played me tricks enough like that for me to be looking out for him by this time? But old fools is the biggest fools there is. Can't learn an old dog new tricks, as the saying is. But my goodness, he never plays them alike, 2 days, and how is a body to know what's coming? He pairs to know just how long he can torment me before I get my dander up. And he knows if he can make out to put me off for a minute or make me laugh, it's all down again and I can't hit him a lick. I ain't doing my duty by that boy, and that's the Lord's truth, goodness knows. Spare the rod and spile the child, as the good book says. I'm a laying up sin and suffering for us both, I know. He's full of the old scratch, but laws a me. He's my own dead sister's boy, poor thing, and I ain't got the heart to lash him somehow. Every time I let him off, my conscience does hurt me so, and every time I hit him, my old heart most breaks. Well, a well, man that is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble, as the scripture says, and I reckon it's so. He'll play hooky this evening, and I'll just be obliged to make him work tomorrow to punish him. It's mighty hard to make him work Saturdays, when all the boys is having holiday. but he hates work more than he hates anything else. And I've got to do some of my duty by him, or I'll be the ruination of the child. Tom did play hooky, and he had a very good time. He got back home barely in season to help Jim, the small colored boy, saw next day's wood and split the kindlings before supper. At least he was there in time to tell his adventures to Jim, while Jim did 3/4 of the work. Tom's younger brother, or rather half-brother, Sid, was already through with his part of the work, picking up chips, for he was a quiet boy and had no adventurous, troublesome ways. While Tom was eating his supper and stealing sugar as opportunity offered, Aunt Polly asked him questions that were full of guile and very deep, for she wanted to trap him into damaging revealments. Like many other simple-hearted souls, it was her pet vanity to believe she was endowed with a talent for dark and mysterious diplomacy, and she loved to contemplate a trait in herself which was nothing but a liberal and unconscious borrowing of the ideas of the other people. She said, "Tom, it was middling warm in school, warn't it?" "Yes'm." "Powerful warm, warn't it?" "Yes'm." "Didn't you want to go in a swimming, Tom?" A bit of a scare shot through Tom, a touch of uncomfortable suspicion. He searched Aunt Polly's face, but it told him nothing. So he said, "No'm, well, not very much." The old lady reached out her hand and felt Tom's shirt and said, "But you ain't too warm now, though." And it flattered her to reflect that she had discovered that the shirt was dry without anybody knowing that that was what she had in her mind. But in her honesty, she could not keep still, so she said, "But what makes you dry now when you was so warm a while ago?" Tom was in a corner now that he was sorry he had ventured into. He turned his eye upon Aunt Polly and said, "Why, bless your heart, Aunt Polly. You see, we was all a-playing, and I ran and found a little bit of water, and I sprinkled it on me. That's the way I come to be wet." "Oh, Tom, don't lie to me. I know you've been in swimming. Why wouldn't you let me hear you?" Tom looked at her hand about his collar, and said, "Now, Aunt Polly, don't make me do it, please. If I told you, you wouldn't believe me, would you?" His aunt bent over him to try to see his face, but he covered his head with his arm and sobbed out, "There now. It's no use. They all said I wouldn't tell you. They're playing hooky, Aunt Polly, and I told 'em not to." Her suspicions faded. She let go of his shirt, and Tom hugged himself in secret delight. And yet, I can't seem to catch that boy a single time to save my life. I don't know what to do with him. While Aunt Polly was pondering her next move, Tom sneaked out the back door. He made his way down the street, keeping an eye out for any sign of Sid or Aunt Polly. As he rounded the corner, he bumped straight into a new boy, a stranger in the village, judging by his fancy clothes. The two boys stared at each other, sizing each other up. The new boy was well-dressed, wearing a necktie and shoes, things Tom considered unnecessary luxuries. Tom, on the other hand, was barefoot, with a shabby hat and the air of someone who was always looking for trouble. "What are you looking at?" said the new boy. "What do you think I'm looking at?" retorted Tom. "Well, I reckon you're looking for trouble." "Maybe I am. You going to do something about it?" The boys circled each other, their tempers rising. Finally, words gave way to action, and the two fell to wrestling in the dust of the street. They rolled, tumbled, and fought with all their might, neither willing to concede defeat. Tom eventually got the upper hand, pinning the boy down. "Say enough," he demanded. "Enough!" cried the new boy, begrudgingly admitting defeat. Tom let him go, but not before making a grand show of brushing himself off as though the fight had been an easy victory. The new boy picked himself up, dusted off his clothes, and shouted, "I'll tell my big brother on you." "Go ahead," Tom called after him, grinning with satisfaction. The new boy retreated, and Tom sauntered off, feeling victorious. He made his way home, prepared to face Aunt Polly's wrath, but secretly proud of his day's adventures. Saturday morning was come, and all the summer world was bright and fresh and brimming with life. There was a song in every heart, and if the heart was young, the music issued at the lips. There was cheer in every face and a spring in every step. The locust trees were in bloom, and the fragrance of the blossoms filled the air. Cardiff Hill, beyond the village and above it, was green with vegetation, and it lay just far enough away to seem a delectable land, dreamy, reposeful, and inviting. Tom appeared on the sidewalk with a bucket of whitewash and a long-handled brush. He surveyed the fence, and all gladness left him, and a deep melancholy settled down upon his spirit. 30 yards of board fence 9 feet high. Life to him seemed hollow, and existence but a burden. Sighing, he dipped his brush and passed it along the topmost plank, repeated the operation, did it again, compared the insignificant whitewashed streak with the far-reaching continent of unwhitewashed fence, and sat down on a tree box discouraged. Jim came skipping out at the gate with a tin pail and singing Buffalo Gals. Bringing water from the town pump had always been hateful work in Tom's eyes before, but now it did not strike him so. He remembered that there was company at the pump. White, mulatto, and Negro boys and girls were always there waiting their turns, resting, trading playthings, quarreling, fighting, skylarking. And he remembered that although the pump was only 150 yards off, Jim never got back with a bucket of water under an hour. And even then, somebody generally had to go after him. Tom said, "Say, Jim, I'll fetch the water if you'll whitewash some." Jim shook his head and said, "Can't, Mars Tom. Ol' missus, she told me I got to go and get dis water and not stop foolin' round wid anybody. She say she spick Mars Tom gwine to ax me to whitewash, and so she told me go long and tend to my own business. She 'lowed she'd tend to the whitewashin'." "Oh, never you mind what she said, Jim. That's the way she always talks. Give me the bucket. I won't be gone only a minute. She won't ever know." "Oh, I dasn't, Mars Tom. Ol' missus she'd take and tar the head offen me. 'Deed she would. She never licks anybody. Whacks 'em over the head with her thimble. And who cares for that? I'd like to know. She talks awful, but talk don't hurt. Anyways, it don't if she don't cry. Jim, I'll give you a marvel. I'll give you a white alley." Jim began to waver. "White alley, Jim, and it's a bully taw. My, that's a mighty gay marvel, I tell you. But Mars, Tom I's powerful 'fraid ol' missus. And besides, if you will, I'll show you my sore toe." Jim was only human. This attraction was too much for him. He put down his pail, took the white alley, and bent over the toe with absorbing interest while the bandage was being unwound. In another moment he was flying down the street with his pail and a tingling rear. Tom was whitewashing with vigor, and Aunt Polly was retiring from the field with a slipper in her hand and triumph in her eye. But Tom's energy did not last. he began to think of the fun he had planned for this day, and his sorrows multiplied. Soon the free boys would come tripping along on all sorts of delicious expeditions, and they would make a world of fun of him for having to work. The very thought of it burnt him like fire. He got out his worldly wealth and examined it. Bits of toys, marbles, and trash. Enough to buy an exchange of work, maybe, but not half enough to buy so much as half an hour of pure freedom. So he returned his straitened means to his pocket and gave up the idea of trying to buy the boys. At this dark and hopeless moment, an inspiration burst upon him. Nothing less than a great, magnificent inspiration. He took up his brush and went tranquilly to work. Ben Rogers hove in sight presently, the very boy of all boys whose ridicule he had been dreading. Ben's gait was the hop, skip, and jump, proof enough that his heart was light and his anticipations high. He was eating an apple and giving a long, melodious whoop at intervals, followed by a deep-toned ding-dong-dong, ding-dong-dong, for he was personating a steamboat. As he drew near, he slackened speed, took the middle of the street, leaned far over to starboard, and rounded to ponderously and with laborious pomp and circumstance. For he was personating the big Missouri, and considered himself to be drawing 9 feet of water. He was boat and captain and engine bells combined, so he had to imagine himself standing on his own hurricane deck, giving the orders and executing them. "Stop her, sir! Ting-a-ling-ling!" The headway ran almost out, and he drew up slowly toward the sidewalk. "Ship up to back! Ting-a-ling-ling!" His arms straightened and stiffened down his sides. "Set her back on the starboard! Ting-a-ling-ling! Chow! Cha-chow, wow! Chow!" His right hand, meantime, describing stately circles, for it was representing a 40-foot wheel. "Let her go back on the larboard. Ting-a-ling-ling. Chow-chow-chow." The left hand began to describe circles. "Stop the starboard. Ting-a-ling-ling. Stop the larboard. Come ahead on the starboard. Stop her. Let your outside turn over slow. Ting-a-ling-ling. Chow-ow-ow. Get out that headline. Lively now. Come, out with your spring line. What are you about there? Take a turn round that stump with the bite of it. Stand by that stage now. Let her go. Done with the engines, sir. Ting-a-ling-ling. Shut, shut, shut. Trying the gauge cocks. Tom went on whitewashing, paid no attention to the steamboat. Ben stared a moment and then said, "Hi-yi. You're up a stump, ain't you?" No answer. Tom surveyed his last touch with the eye of an artist. Then he gave his brush another gentle sweep and surveyed the result as before. Ben ranged up alongside of him. Tom's mouth watered for the apple, but he stuck to his work. Ben said, "Hello, old chap. You gotta work, hey?" Tom wheeled suddenly and said, "Why, it's you, Ben. I weren't noticing." "Say, I'm going in a swimming, I am. Don't you wish you could? But of course you'd druther work, wouldn't you? Course you would." Tom contemplated the boy a bit and said, "What do you call work?" "Why, ain't that work?" Tom resumed his whitewashing and answered carelessly, "Well, maybe it is, and maybe it ain't. All I know is, it suits Tom Sawyer." "Oh, come now. You don't mean to let on that you like it?" The brush continued to move. "Like it? Well, I don't see why I oughtn't to like it. Does a boy get a chance to whitewash a fence every day?" That put the thing in a new light. Ben stopped nibbling his apple. Tom swept his brush daintily back and forth, stepped back to note the effect, added a touch here and there, criticized the effect again. Ben watched every move and got more and more interested, more and more absorbed. Presently he said, "Say, Tom, let me whitewash a little." Tom considered, was about to consent, but he altered his mind. No, I reckon it wouldn't hardly do, Ben. You see, Aunt Polly's awful particular about this fence, right here on the street, you know. But if it was the back fence, I wouldn't mind, and she wouldn't. Yes, she's awful particular about this fence. It's got to be done very careful. I reckon there ain't one boy in 1,000, maybe 2,000, that can do it the way it's got to be done. No, is that so? Oh, come now, let me just try. Only just a little. I'd let you, if you was me, Tom. Ben, I'd like to, honest Injun. But Aunt Polly, well, Jim wanted to do it, but she wouldn't let him. Sid wanted to do it, and she wouldn't let Sid. Now, don't you see how I'm fixed? If he was to tackle this fence and anything was to happen to it, oh, shucks, I'll be just as careful. Now let me try. Say, I'll give you the core of my apple. Well, here, no, Ben, now don't. I'm afeard. I'll give you all of it. Tom gave up the brush with reluctance in his face, but alacrity in his heart. And while the late steamer Big Missouri worked and sweated in the sun, the retired artist sat on a barrel in the shade close by, dangled his legs, munched his apple, and planned the slaughter of more innocents. There was no lack of material. Boys happened along every little while. They came to jeer, but remained to whitewash. By the time Ben was fagged out, Tom had traded the next chance to Billy Fisher for a kite, in good repair. And when he played out, Johnny Miller bought in for a dead rat and a string to swing it with. And so on, hour after hour. And when the middle of the afternoon came, from being a poor, poverty-stricken boy in the morning, Tom was literally rolling in wealth. He had, besides the things before mentioned, 12 marbles, part of a Jew's harp, a piece of blue bottle glass to look through, a spool cannon, a key that wouldn't unlock anything, a fragment of chalk, a glass stopper of a decanter, a tin soldier, a couple of tadpoles, 6 firecrackers, a kitten with only one eye, a brass doorknob, a dog collar, but no dog, the handle of a knife, 4 pieces of orange peel, and a dilapidated old window sash. He had had a nice, good, idle time all the while, plenty of company, and the fence had 3 coats of whitewash on it. If he hadn't run out of whitewash, he would have bankrupted every boy in the village. Tom said to himself that it was not such a hollow world after all. He had discovered a great law of human action without knowing it. Namely, that in order to make a man or a boy covet a thing, it is only necessary to make the thing difficult to attain. If he had been a great and wise philosopher, like the writer of this book, he would now have comprehended that work consists of whatever a body is obliged to do, and that play consists of whatever a body is not obliged to do. And this would help him to understand why constructing artificial flowers or performing on a treadmill is work, while rolling 10 pins or climbing Mont Blanc is only amusement. There are wealthy gentlemen in England who drive 4-horse passenger coaches 20 or 30 miles on a daily line in the summer, because the privilege costs them considerable money. But if they were offered wages for the service, that would turn it into work, and then they would resign. Tom Sawyer went to bed that night with his pockets full of treasures and an ache in his heart for the more things he had coveted and failed to secure. He had had a long, hot, wearying day, and when he crept to his rest at last, his soul was satisfied with the day's adventures. But he was not happy, for his greed and ambition had been aroused. He was, however, in the beginning stages of a career that was destined to be marked by much cunning and many triumphs. He said to himself that he would be a pirate. He would sail the seas, pillage ships, and hoard treasure. But for now, he was content to dream. Tom presented himself before Aunt Polly, who was sitting by an open window in a pleasant rearward apartment, which was bedroom, breakfast room, dining room, and library combined. The balmy summer air, the restful quiet, the odor of the flowers and the drowsing murmur of the bees had had their effect, and she was nodding over her knitting, for she had no company but the cat, and it was asleep in her lap. Her spectacles were propped up on her gray head for safety. She had thought that of course Tom had deserted long ago, and she wondered at seeing him place himself in her power again in this intrepid way. He said, "Mayn't I go and play now, Aunt?" "What, already? How much have you done?" "It's all done, Aunt." "Tom, don't lie to me. I can't bear it." "I ain't, Aunt. It is all done." Aunt Polly placed small trust in such evidence. She went out to see for herself, and she would have been content to find 20% of Tom's statement true. When she found the entire fence whitewashed, and not only whitewashed but elaborately coated and recoated, and even a streak added to the ground, her astonishment was almost unspeakable. She said, "Well, I never. There's no getting around it. You can work when you're a mind to, Tom." And then she diluted the compliment by adding, "But it's powerful seldom you're a mind to, I'm bound to say. Well, go long and play, but mind you get back some time in a week or I'll tan you." She was so overcome by the splendor of his achievement that she took him into the closet and selected a choice apple and delivered it to him, along with an improving lecture upon the added value and flavor a treat took to itself when it came without sin through virtuous effort. And, while she closed with a happy scriptural flourish, he hooked a donut. Then he skipped out and saw Sid just starting up the outside stairway that led to the back rooms on the second floor. Clods were handy, and the air was full of them in a twinkling. They raged around Sid like a hailstorm, and before Aunt Polly could collect her surprised faculties and sally to the rescue, 6 or 7 clods had taken personal effect, and Tom was over the fence and gone. There was a gate, but as a general thing he was too crowded for time to make use of it. His soul was at peace, now that he had settled with Sid for calling attention to his black thread and getting him into trouble. Tom skirted the block and came round into a muddy alley that led behind the village. He was beyond the reach of capture now, and he skipped out, as he called it, and went whistling down the alley with his mouth full of harmony and his soul full of gratitude. He bent his steps toward the public square, for he was having it out with some other boys who were hatching a war. By the time Tom arrived, there was already a small war party formed under the leadership of Joe Harper, who declared himself the general. Tom joined them, and the boys split into 2 sides, with Tom commanding the opposing faction. They reenacted scenes of heroic battles, charging each other with sticks for swords and dirt clods for cannonballs. Tom fought valiantly, relishing the glory, even as his followers pretended dramatic deaths. At last, when the battle was over, Tom felt victorious and satisfied. As Tom left the battlefield, feeling triumphant, he wandered toward the public square, where his eyes caught sight of a new girl in town. She was a lovely little creature with blue eyes, golden hair plaited into 2 long tails, and the prettiest dress he had ever seen. She was standing in the yard of her house, and Tom stopped in his tracks, staring at her. He had never seen anyone like her before. His heart began to thump, and a new sensation took hold of him. Tom was smitten. The girl glanced at him for a moment, and then turned away with a toss of her head. She ran into the house, leaving Tom standing there, utterly enchanted. He stayed rooted to the spot, hoping she would come out again. She did, after a little while, holding a pansy in her hand. She walked up and down the garden path, pretending not to see him, but Tom was not to be ignored. He began to show off, standing on his head, turning somersaults and performing all sorts of ridiculous antics to win her attention. For a moment, the girl seemed unimpressed, but eventually she sneaked a glance at him, and Tom felt encouraged. He pulled out his most daring trick, walking along the top of the fence. It was a risky maneuver, but Tom managed to pull it off, and when he jumped to the ground, he saw that she was clapping her hands and laughing. Before he could speak to her, she turned and ran back into the house. Tom was beside himself. He waited for what felt like hours, but was only a few minutes, hoping she would reappear. When she didn't, he sighed heavily and began to walk away, but not before drawing a large heart in the dirt and writing "Tom loves Becky" inside it with a stick. That night, Tom lay awake thinking about the girl. He didn't even know her name yet, but he was determined to find out. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he felt certain that he would love her forever. The next day, at school, Tom was inattentive and dreamy. He barely noticed when his teacher scolded him for not knowing his lessons. His thoughts were consumed with visions of the new girl, and how he might win her heart. When the noon bell rang, signaling the start of recess, Tom raced outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. As luck would have it, she was there, standing near the schoolyard fence. Tom approached her cautiously, trying to look casual. "Hello?" he said, his voice trembling slightly. She looked at him shyly. "Hello," she replied. "What's your name?" he asked. "Becky Thatcher," she said. "I'm Tom Sawyer," he said, puffing up his chest a little. "Do you like marbles?" "Yes," she said, smiling. Tom's heart soared. He pulled a handful of marbles from his pocket and began showing them off, explaining which ones were his favorites and how he had won them. Becky seemed impressed, and before long the two of them were laughing and talking as if they had known each other forever. When the bell rang, calling them back to class, Tom felt as if he were walking on air. Becky Thatcher liked him, and he was determined to make her his girl. The sun rose upon a tranquil world, and beamed down upon the peaceful village like a benediction. Breakfast was on the table, and Aunt Polly was at her post, seeing that all who came were properly supplied with wholesome provisions. Tom appeared in his Sunday clothes and looked over the articles of his costume with the air of one who felt that life was on a solid footing now, and who was prepared to meet its requirements. He had been restless and full of chafings and repinings. Conscience-smitten, too. He could not meet Amy Lawrence's eye. He could not brook her loving gaze. But when he saw Becky Thatcher's coquettish little face peeping out at him from behind her mother's shoulder, he quickly forgot the lesser griefs of life. He threw himself upon his book with an earnestness that almost delighted the teacher. He kept the end of a long stick in his mouth, chewing it with relish. He was charmed to see how all his worldly troubles slipped away under its soothing influence. Presently, his mind wandered to the farthest ends of the earth, where distant seas rolled in unfathomable mystery. and where the storm-lashed billows dashed madly upon the craggy shores. He saw himself as a fearless pirate, scudding over the waves and conquering islands with the same reckless abandon as his heroes of old. The tension broke with the striking of the bell, calling the class to order. Tom Sawyer stepped into the classroom and took his seat at the head of the line. There was a hush of expectation as the teacher entered, his long coat brushing the floor. He held a Bible in one hand and a hymnal in the other, and his stern countenance bore an air of solemn gravity. He called upon the children to rise and recite their lessons, and they obeyed with trembling voices. Tom's mind wandered during the recitations, and he spent the time devising schemes to capture Becky Thatcher's attention. Finally, his turn came, and he rose to his feet, but his thoughts were so jumbled that he could scarcely remember the words. He stammered and stumbled, and the teacher frowned in disappointment. Tom slumped back into his seat, feeling humiliated. At the close of the lesson, the teacher announced that there would be a prize awarded to the student who could recite the most Bible verses from memory. Tom had heard of this prize before. It was a richly bound Bible with gilt edges and a crimson ribbon, the envy of every child in the village. He had never imagined that he might win it, but now the possibility seemed tantalizingly within his grasp. Tom looked around the room and saw that the other children were busy studying their verses. He realized that he would need to work harder than ever if he hoped to claim the prize. He bent over his book and began to read, but the words blurred before his eyes, and his mind wandered once again. Tom struggled to focus on his Bible verses, but his mischievous nature got the better of him. He began whispering and trading small trinkets with other children in the classroom, including bits of chalk, marbles, and fishhooks. Tom was bartering for yellow tickets, which were given to students as rewards for memorizing verses. 10 yellow tickets could be exchanged for a red ticket, and 10 red tickets for a blue one. Collecting enough blue tickets would earn the prize Bible. Tom's cunning plan unfolded as he amassed enough tickets through trades and bribes to qualify for the prize, without actually learning the required verses. When the teacher announced that a visitor, Judge Thatcher, Becky Thatcher's father, was present, the excitement in the room heightened. Judge Thatcher was a distinguished man, respected by everyone in the village, and his approval carried great weight. The teacher, eager to impress Judge Thatcher, called for Tom to step forward as a shining example of the Sunday school's success. Tom walked up, flushed with a mixture of pride and dread. He was handed the prize Bible, and Judge Thatcher looked at him approvingly. "My boy, you ought to be very proud of yourself," said the judge. "Now, can you tell us the names of the first 2 disciples?" Tom's face turned pale. He hadn't anticipated such a test. He shifted uncomfortably and stammered, "David and Goliath." The entire class erupted in laughter, and the teacher's face turned crimson with embarrassment. Judge Thatcher, struggling to maintain his composure, smiled weakly and said, "Well, no matter. The boy's effort is commendable." Tom returned to his seat with the prized Bible, but his triumph felt hollow. He could feel Becky Thatcher's eyes on him, and he wondered if she was impressed or mortified by his blunder. Either way, Tom's ambition and knack for mischief had made him the center of attention once again. Thank you for joining me tonight. I hope this story has brought you peace and comfort. If you'd like to continue exploring classic tales or peaceful bedtime stories, be sure to join us again here at Mr. Sleep Story. Sweet dreams and good night.